Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. My guest for this episode was Rosie Hodsdon, who is an assistant tutor at the University of Sunderland. Rosie is completing a PhD, and her areas of interest include sex work, BDSM, and other aspects of gender and sexuality, and in particular, pornography and the laws surrounding pornography. I would say at this time that some of the discussion is quite detailed and quite graphic, and so if you do not want to listen to areas and interests to do with the idea of sex and sexuality, then please do switch off now. But I'm sure there's lots of you whose ears have just pricked up and do want to listen to a discussion about those issues. And if you do, I think you'll find this one absolutely fascinating. So without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Do you want to start by introducing yourself, please?
Hi, my name's Rosie Hodsdon. And I am a final year PhD student and lecturer at Northumbria and Sunderland universities.
Thank you, Rosie. And what's your history in the subject of sociology? Where did it all start for you?
So I started examining sociology as a discipline specifically once I got to university. Before that, my school didn't offer sociology, and it was one of those things that I always thought was quite interesting, but never really felt a particular pull towards until I started doing my university applications. And a couple of open days later, and suddenly I've been sort of bitten by the bug for it. It covered so many different aspects of what I enjoyed, what I was fascinated by, and it really fell in line with a lot of what my interests were. I liked the fact that it covered so many different subjects in one. So there was geography in there was a bit of psychology, there was a bit of philosophy, there was a bit of biology, there was a little bit of everything really. Ended up here. So I did my undergrad in anthropology and sociology as a combined honours at Durham, graduated from that in 2016, and then from that moved into a law school to do my PhD, which is quite a socio-legal type perspective, and then returned home to sociology to start teaching again, which was great.
Brilliant. And when you studied sociology, was there any particular theories or sociologists that really inspired you, who sort of got you interested in the subject, if you like?
Ooh, it's a difficult one. I feel like the ones that I'm always very naturally drawn to are sort of either symbolic interactionist type theories. I remember my first lecture on Goffman, and that was in my first term of my sociology degree, and it felt like something clicked inside my head. And it's like every other theorist that we'd talked about it was all interesting and I could see how they were relevant, but that's the one where it went, I see how this fits into my life and how I view the world and how I understand interactions between people, and it gives a name to something that I'd always sort of considered being there. I've never really understood in a theoretical sense before. And from there I moved into reading Hochschild and things like that, and as someone who worked in customer service for a very long time, that really spoke to me. And as well as that, I've also really been enjoying sort of feminist theory and Gail Rubin's Charm Circle, which has influenced quite a lot I've been doing since then.
Great. So you're obviously interested in anything to do with kind of identity, presentation of self, those sort of factors?
Yeah, and very specifically sexualities, genders, that sort of stuff. It's absolutely fascinating to me.
And this is where a lot of listeners' ears will prick up, because we're going to talk about your own research and what your own areas of research is. And I think everyone's going to be interested in this one. So go for it, Rosie. Tell us what your main research is about.
So my research at the moment is looking at the legal consciousness amongst porn performers in the UK. So I am working at the moment, finishing up my PhD, and I'm working with a particular studio in the UK that produces particularly sort of BDSM and fetish themed pornography, and about how they interact with the law, how they interact with each other. Part of it is looking at the age verification laws, because that was all going on when I was doing my fieldwork and collecting my data. But at the same time, there's really not a lot of research on what the industry in the UK looks like generally. So I'm looking at mapping what that looks like, what the individuals in that industry are like, what the studio is like, relationships, labour, gender, all of those sorts of different factors. There's a lot of different things all playing into one different thing.
Great. And if we could start with some of the basics. You mentioned the word fetish, and I know I was doing some research on you. You talk about kink and fetish. Just for the listeners, how do you define those terms? What do you mean by kink? What do you mean by fetish?
Ooh, I feel like that's a difficult one because I tend to go by my own participants' definition of the terms. And it feels like a lot of that discussion goes into the idea of what is considered pornography and what isn't. And there's a very delicate balance there between creator intent and end use. So a creator could put something out there that is entirely, to them, not a sexual thing at all, whereas someone who looks at that as an end product might go, this is the hottest thing in the world to me, and fantasize about that and use that to feed sort of sexual fantasies and those sorts of things. Whereas at the same time, someone might put something out there specifically with the intention of, this is a sexual thing and this is what I'm intending it to be used for, but not everyone is going to use it for that, and not everyone is going to view it in the same way. So there's a really fascinating dynamic there between sort of producer and consumer. And a lot of what is coming through in my research, particularly with a lot of my participants, is the fact that they feel the way that they are presenting themselves in their work is quite an authentic version of their own sexuality.
Right.
And the reason why a lot of them got into doing this, not entirely, there are some who have come in from a purely sort of work perspective, but a lot of them have come in from, this is my authentic sexuality that I am portraying on camera, or this version of my sexuality that I'm portraying on camera. So there's quite an interesting dynamic there between sort of desire and self-perception that I'm still sort of working on teasing out. So it's difficult to say specifically sort of what is kink and what is fetish, because everyone is to define it in such different ways.
It's subjective, right?
Very.
Because one of the things that I was going to ask you about is what you've just described is very different from perhaps what some people believe about porn, that, you know, that people are forced into it. It's an oppressive, you know, if we think about a lot of the radical feminist ideas. So is your research showing that actually porn is quite different from the outside perception?
Very much so. And particularly the structure of the industry in the UK is very different to this sort of big Porn Inc. Conglomerate that is sort of the typical perception of what the industry looks like. That's much more of a sort of a USA type thing. But what we're seeing at the moment, and it's getting even more common with sort of code and things like that, is the sort of democratization of pornography, and it being put much more into the hands of performers who are becoming their own creators rather than working for large studios. It's people putting out much more sort of small scale content. So they might have high production values, or they might not. It might be very much sort of amateur themed content, or it might be something that they've just filmed alone with a phone camera. We've seen the rise of sites like OnlyFans, ManyVids, Clips for Sale, I Want Clips, all of these different sites that are sort of rising and actually getting even bigger because we're in lockdown, and it's an avenue that performers can use to earn money without having to rely on the work of a whole group of people. It can just be them by themselves. It can be them with their real life partners. And that's something that they can do and earn money outside of that. So you're seeing almost the industry dividing into two, where you've got, on the one hand, you've got this big production company on one side, and then you've got this sort of democratic porn 2.0 participatory form of creation. But equally, it's not sort of a one or the other. Performers particularly can use both. Even some producers might use both to be able to advertise their content or as an additional marketing channel. So a company might have their own website, but they'll also have a clip store because they know that that's somewhere that they will get more traffic and more sales. So it's more of a spectrum rather than sort of two very distinct things.
Yeah, and I probably should have asked you this right at the beginning, but I'm guessing from what you're saying, you are pro porn rather than anti porn.
It's a difficult one. Yeah. I am pro performer rights. I am pro listening to performer and producer voices. I'm not necessarily pro pornography. I'm also not anti pornography. I feel like recognizing that pornography is just a thing. It's not a good thing inherently. It's not a bad thing inherently. It can be used for good. It can be used for bad. Ultimately, it is a neutral thing where the way it's going to be sort of taken and used is more important in viewing it rather than the thing in and of itself. I feel like the thing in and of itself is it's just a thing, the same way any other object is, the same way any other media is. Some is good, some is bad. That's okay.
Yeah. So just to go back to something I asked you kind of previously, then would you say that your research has shown there's still an element of exploitation out there? You know, quite a lot of writing particularly talks about the exploitation of the females within pornography. That still exists, right?
It's an interesting one because the way that performers will conceptualize their labor doesn't necessarily get away from the idea of exploitation, but it plays into broader ideas of what the sex worker rights movement looks like. Right. And the idea that actually porn labor is not necessarily extraordinarily exploitative, but the idea that labor is an inherently exploitative practice. So it gets more into sort of Marxist theory in that. And I found the perspectives of the sex workers' rights movement generally absolutely fascinating on this. So it's the idea that work to be able to survive, the fact that we have to earn money so we can eat, so we can have a house, so we can have clothes, so we can feed our families, so we can do all of these different things. That aspect of things is really fascinating to me. So I feel very strongly about listening to performers in that sense. And that's not to say that exploitation in a more traditional sense doesn't happen in the industry as well, but that's also not to say that that is exceptional. The fact exploitation occurs in pretty much every industry on the planet. And we don't need to exceptionalize and demonize pornography, because what that then does is it alienates performers particularly from being able to achieve good outcomes when that exploitation does happen. What happens is you get this idea that porn is sort of known for being exploitative. So if someone then does have something bad happen to them, that's just then dismissed as an occupational hazard rather than being something that is taken seriously. It gets taken as, oh, well, you should know that was going to happen when you got into porn, rather than actually that's a really awful thing to have happened and I'm really sorry that this happened to you. It takes that avenue away from them. So the more that we say that porn is inherently exploitative, the less power we give to performers to be able to take action when that exploitation does happen.
That's interesting. And so I suppose that the changes that you mentioned, going from the big sort of mainstream companies to becoming more independent, that's sort of given performers more freedom, more independence, more autonomy over what they're doing, I'm guessing?
Absolutely, yeah. And I feel like it does give people the opportunity to produce things that they feel are what they enjoy. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everything they put out there is going to be a depiction of their own genuine kinks or whatever, or it's going to be sort of them, what they would naturally be like in a sort of sexual environment or that sort of thing. But it does mean that they have control over what it is that they're putting out. And that gives them much more freedom over how they film it, who they film it with, how they present themselves. It gives them a lot more freedom to do those sorts of things.
So do you think we could actually see an end to those big corporations. That if you look at, perhaps popularity, will it move to more towards those kind of independents rather than the big organizations?
I think there's room for both. I think the appeal of both is very different. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got the sort of the big porn companies which have high production values, that have very set ways of working, that have well-known brand names so they can get a wide audience to what they're doing. And then on the other hand, you've got this idea of authenticity and intimacy, which is being sort of shown through the more sort of OnlyFans, ManyVids type content. And this is obviously helped with things like social media, so Twitter and Instagram and kind of Facebook, but Facebook is not especially sex worker friendly, and neither is Instagram really. But they allow that different degree of connectivity. And so on the one hand, you've got this sort of marketing tool aspect of it. And on the other hand, you've got this sort of idea that you're getting an intimate, unfiltered, authentic version of who this performer is. And I feel like the industry is very much going that way. And that's not to say that it is an authentic version of who it is. And in fact, a lot of performers particularly are saying that they still really have to think about what they put out there, because they are still trying to portray a particular image.
Yes.
But it's the idea of authenticity which is sort of enticing for consumers.
Yeah, I mean, pornography has certainly changed a long way since, the dodgy 70s music, etc. Yeah. So what else has really changed in the last sort of 5 to 10 years within pornography, would you say?
There are a lot of sort of good and bad things, and I think I have mentioned a lot of them. So the move towards a more clip-based sort of thing, and the interactivity aspect of things, I think, are the two really, really big ones. On the other side of things, you've got a lot of fear and a lot of worry over the law and the narratives that are being shaped around porn performers and that sort of thing. So in the UK, we've had the age verification debacle, which has been going on for the last forever. And in the US, you've had Foster Sesta, which is sort of intended to stop things like human trafficking and that sort of thing. But what the legislation does is that it encompasses all forms of consensual and non-consensual sex work in one term and one piece of legislation. So what this is actually doing is it is affecting consensual sex work just as the same as severe exploitation. And that means that it is reducing the sorts of channels that people can use. And it also means that there are tougher restrictions on a lot of platforms, with things like OnlyFans is a particularly strong example, and people will get kicked off of OnlyFans if they even mention doing other forms of sex work, an online sort of thing. And if someone like messages a performer and says, "Hey, these are great, I love your videos, can we meet?" that puts the performer in jeopardy. So there are a whole lot of different regulations that performers have to work their way around and navigate to be able to actually maintain their business and stop having some pretty severe consequences. Alongside that, there are issues with banking. There are a lot of banking services that won't allow sex workers to use them, again, because of things like Foster Sesta, or just moral objections. So things like PayPal are really sex worker unfriendly. So again, that can be another big obstacle for them to navigate around. And it's not necessarily sort of something that has changed in the last few years, but it's become more prominent because this is the way that sex work is going as an industry, and porn is just one part of that much broader landscape.
Thank you, Rosie. That's going to be the end of part one. In part two, I'd like to talk to you more about the law side of pornography. Hi, welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show. Rosie, we were talking in part one about the laws surrounding pornography. There seems to be changing ideas all the time. You quite often hear rumours going around, Pornhub's going to be shut down, things are going to have to, you're not going to be able to look at free porn anymore, subscriptions are going to change. What is the law in terms of UK and pornography? What is and isn't allowed, for example?
Oh God, it's stumbling into a complicated territory.
Big question, yeah.
So at the moment, you can now, it's been very complicated over the last few years. So in the last couple of years, we've had the Audiovisual Media Services Regulations. And what that intended to do is to stop a lot of forms of consensual BDSM play from being shown in pornography. So it would not only be things like things that were dangerous, things that were sort of legitimately dangerous, like sort of choking and things like that, but it would also be things like face sitting, which is an activity which is primarily done for female pleasure, or people with vulvas and that sort of thing. So that is that was generally decried as quite a sexist thing. And the other was female ejaculation, squirting, and that was generally because the people at the BBFC who were in control of these regulations basically said, yeah, that's not a thing, that's just pee. Research is out on that one. It's it's a very contentious field. I am in the sort of field where I get to read the research on that sort of thing. So that was a big thing for a while. That's now been changed, and these things are all fine to show in pornography again, so long as it doesn't cross the line into illegal. Again, the legality around things is very difficult because of the Spanner case and the idea that you can't consent to anything that would be actual or grievous bodily harm. So anything that would leave marks and bruises can be in a little bit of a dodgy legal territory. There are 5 things now, it's changed, that you now can't show in UK law under extreme pornography. So that is bestiality, fairly self-explanatory. Necrophilia, also fairly self-explanatory. Anything that would seriously endanger a person's life, and anything that could conceivably cause serious injury to a person's anus, breasts, or genitals. Those final 2 have been a little bit contentious over how you actually define these in UK law. And the final one, which is actually added as an amendment a few years later, is that you can't show realistic depictions of non-consent. So that's generally regarded as like rape pornography, that sort of thing. As well as that, things like revenge porn is obviously not legal. But the tricky sort of bit to navigate around that is the idea of what could conceivably cause serious injury. And there was a case a couple of years back where someone had photographs of themselves attending a BDSM party and being fisted at that particular party, and you had to have expert witnesses in the court at the time explaining how to safely fist someone and trying to prove that that was not an activity that would feasibly cause that sort of serious injury. So that's the sort of point that the law is at the moment.
You must have some interesting research, Rosie.
Oh, yes.
That's interesting then, because a lot of what you've just mentioned, obviously there is a lot of free-to-view pornography which does blur those lines. So how does it get away with it, basically what I'm saying? How is some pornography out there which clearly does breach those restrictions?
So there are some laws that are around creation and some laws that are around possession. So that, for a start, brings things into sort of very new territory, because the extreme pornography type things you're not allowed to possess. That's actually the first law in the UK that has been about possessing something rather than creating it. As far as sort of free pornography and things like that goes, basically I think the main thing is that it's just so great that it can't really be controlled. And it's not just the sort of aspects of viewing it, but certainly from my research as well, the aspects of uploading it and sharing it and spreading it, because a lot of that material on free-to-view websites is pirated content. And so that's not only breaching copyright, and it's up to performers and producers and studios to actively get that work taken down that's been stolen off them. So they have to submit DMCA takedown notices for each and every single video of theirs that is uploaded without their consent. There is also just people who can use these sites in a completely sort of similar way to how you'd use a clip site and that sort of thing. So there's things like Pornhub Verified, where that you can get a little tick next to your name, which shows that you have been age verified by Pornhub to show that you are over 18, and you get a little bit of revenue every time someone views that video. And it's a really tiny amount of revenue, but you do get some income from that being up there, and you have control over the content that you upload through that platform. But yeah, I think the main thing is that MindGeek, who is the company behind, I think it's 8 out of 10 of the world's biggest porn sites, is huge. It's got so much power, and the amount of video content that is uploaded to the internet every second is just too huge to be able to deal with. You get into a whole idea about how can you regulate the internet when the internet is such a vast landscape of stuff.
Yes.
And that's where it gets very difficult.
Yeah, I'm sure I read before about a certain percentage of the top 10 websites in the world of pornographic websites as well. Like you said, that amount of
traffic. Something like that, yeah.
That amount of traffic. And you said about you might be able to regulate the people uploading the videos, but what about the viewer? Because clearly people who are under the age of 18, for example, do look at pornography. If there's just a button that says enter, I agree that I'm over 18, is that enough for it to be legal?
So it's not actually it's not illegal to watch pornography in the UK if you're under 18, but it's illegal to show it deliberately to people who are under 18s. And at the moment, that is that sort of click here if you're over 18 is currently sufficient under UK law. What they tried to do is to change that so that you would have to have some greater security for your age verification, but this ended up becoming a little bit of a mess. So you could either get a porn pass from your local newsagent where you had a code that you could type in, and that would prove that you were over 18, or you would have to use a credit card, or you would have to go through particular verification websites and that sort of thing. And there were a huge number of problems with this. The fact that the government would be able to have access to your pornography viewing habits, and bearing in mind some of the things that we've seen fairly recently with the government and leaking sensitive information, how many people are going to want the government to have access to very private and intimate details about themselves? Also, when you've got a database of people's porn habits, that's going to be a prime target for hackers. That's going to be a prime target for people who want to gather blackmail on people, for tabloids, those sorts of groups of people who want access to that information to be able to monetize it. On the other hand, you've got things like Ashley Madison. So we've seen the dangers of what can happen when that information gets leaked, information that is incredibly private to people. Another way that it could have been done is by using an age verification provider, but that cost would have to be borne by the websites. And as we've said already, the people that are generally making and hosting these websites now are small niche producers. So that puts their business at a loss, and that stops them from being able to actually produce any content because they're too busy age verifying people, which can cost between about 5p to £1.50 per user that they have to age verify to even access their website. Another issue around that was sort of what do we count as pornography and sexual content under that? And there was the idea that things like sex education websites could fall under that.
Yeah.
And as well as that, another one, the government was in discussions with MindGeek, the people that run Pornhub and the other 8 out of 10 most popular websites. MindGeek had come up with an age verification software that would be run in conjunction with the UK government and that companies could sign up to. So not only does that give MindGeek even more control of the pornography market, it means that smaller producers have to use the software that is run by the people who are currently destroying their businesses by pirating content.
Yeah.
And so from an ethical perspective, that can be a really difficult thing to do. You've also got, I've got a lot of thoughts on this, I'm very sorry. Looking into it a little bit further, why are people who are under 18 accessing pornography in the first place. And that obviously that can be a very tricky thing to research because of ethics and things like that. But looking into that issue will explain a lot more about what role pornography is filling in their lives anyway. And looking at it, a lot of the data around pornography access is around things like, I wanted to see how this particular thing was done. I wanted to learn about this particular thing. I wanted to see this particular body type represented. How is queer sex done? What does sex between two women look like, for example? And what this is showing that a lot of people aren't necessarily realizing is that our sex education system has huge failures for young people. And we can't just stick a patch over pornography and say, we've solved the problem. What we actually need to do is to completely revise what our sexual education looks like. And I feel like a much healthier way of navigating pornography in society for people who are under 18 and over 18 is just acknowledging that porn exists, acknowledging what it looks like, acknowledging that actually this is not necessarily what sex looks like in the real world, and incorporating that in a much wider idea of gender relations and sexuality discussion, and making that conversation much more of an open, educational, informative aspect of life, basically. Yeah. And if we can do that, then a lot of the reasons why young people are either accessing pornography or why the fears around young people accessing pornography exist would be alleviated by doing that. Not to mention the fact that if this was to happen and the age verification stuff was to come in and the porn pass thing was to come in, they'd be the first to find their way around it. They know technology. Yes, exactly. So it's not even going to solve the problem.
Yes, exactly. I know, for example, lots of universities or colleges or so on, if they have boarding students, they can block what students can look at. But as you said, they'll find a way. Of course they'll find a way. So yeah, I don't think managing it in that way actually solves anything at all. And I was quite interested in what you just said about what people are looking at, because there's still a perception on the outside that pornography is still made for men and watched by men. Mm-hmm. Does your research actually show that that's a little bit of an antiquated idea now?
Definitely, yeah. And that's not to say that it's not a true idea, in that primarily a lot of pornography consumers are men. But I think there is more of a recognition of the idea that women are also consumers and are watching things. A lot of the time that doesn't tend to make a huge amount of difference. The idea of porn for women as a category can often be sort of an aesthetic idea rather than a content idea. And it assumes that there is this sort of one specific female sexuality that likes to see soft lighting and flowers and everything being slow and gentle and that sort of thing. And that's not what female sexuality looks like. Female sexuality is just as diverse as male sexuality. And I feel like the idea that it's not is so infantilizing in a way. The idea that all women want is to see sort of candles and six packs is so reductive of what people want. And yes, there are certain types of pornography that are made for either men or people with penises, sort of in terms of content. So there's a very, very big category called the jerk-off instruction video, or JOI. And that's something that is quite anatomy specific. And yes, that might be directed at a particular audience, but for the most part, that doesn't necessarily mean that what you produce is only going to appeal to one particular gender or not. It might apply to people who have a specific fetish. It might apply to people who have a specific desire. They might have a crush on a specific person. And that's far more what things are appealing to rather than just necessarily aesthetics.
Thank you, Rosie. We're just coming towards the end of our time, actually. So I'm sure a lot of people listening are absolutely fascinated by this and they want to learn more. So if they do want to learn more, where can they find out about you, your research?
So the best place to find me is on Twitter, and that is at Words with Rosie.
Brilliant. Excellent. Thank you very much for your time today, Rosie. I'm sure the listeners have been fascinated by your research.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Cheers. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.